Another day, another court case, and, well, these days, being a football fan is more like reading a John Grisham novel than a Roy of the Rovers comic. But today, a verdict in the case that Man City had brought against the Premier League, challenging its associated party transaction regulations. I'm going to take a look at what it means, who's won, if anyone, and then see what it means in the broader context, because you can't have failed to notice that football at the moment is at the crossroads. And the future is not necessarily clear, but I want to ask some broader questions, why all this is happening and where this could end up. But one of the things that I found most surprising is the way that some fans have greeted Manchester City's victory over the dark forces of the Premier League, as if it's a sort of good versus evil contest. Manchester City obviously nervous around the 115 charges, which is ongoing and is happening in total secrecy, hidden away from our glare, with it just causing more suspicion. It's really important to remember that today's ruling has nothing to do with those. And we actually knew last week that this was going to be the case because just before a meeting of the Premier League teams, the associated party transaction manifest was taken off of the meeting's roster. So it was already known last week that this case had found, at least in part, in favour of Manchester City. The verdict today is being claimed as a victory for both sides. Manchester City fans are dancing jubilant that they've beaten the Premier League. But what does all of this mean? What are associated party transactions? Well, to understand them fully, we go back to December in 2021 and the Saudi-backed takeover of Newcastle United. The feeling was that when an entity like Saudi Arabia's PIF, the Public Investment Fund, takes over a football club, the amount of money that it can pass through that club without there being any kind of regulations would completely transform the landscape of football in the favour of Newcastle. And to give you some idea of where the concerns are coming from, the Saudi Public Investment Fund is currently thought, had a bit of a surge in value, it's currently thought to be worth something in the area of 925 billion US dollars. It's a big number, a huge number. To give you some idea of the value of that, the entire Premier League is thought to be worth roughly 12 billion. So if the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia decided it wanted to, it could buy the Premier League, the entire Premier League, 77 times over. Not saying it's going to, I'm just saying that you can easily see how that amount of money coming into football would have a transformative effect. We already know this is happening because we've already lived through Roman Abramovich bringing money into football, which changed it forever. Before him, Manchester leveraging the commercial success to bring in money and muscle everybody else out of the way. Money in football is not new, but this size of money is relatively new. And in order to prevent it just washing into football with no one really knowing what would happen, Premier League hastily introduced rules which were designed to ensure that deals done between associated parties or transactions done between associated parties were of a fair market value. And it essentially meant that the Premier League had the right to assess any deal to see if it was fair market value, and that the clubs themselves had the onus of proving that they were doing deals which were fair market value. And the Premier League used a system, an index system, which none of the clubs could access. And so in February, a vote was held, but it was not unanimous. 12 clubs voted to change the rules, 2 abstained, and 6 voted against the changes. So a rift has opened up, but because it wasn't unanimous and because it didn't have enough, didn't have 2/3 majority, there's been an ongoing trial. But Manchester City effectively have taken the Premier League to court, saying that these amount to unfair restrictions on the amount of money it can transact in a commercial way. And there is probably some truth to this. It's not an open and shut case. So what seems to have been decided today is that clubs shouldn't shoulder the burden of proving that a transaction is fair market value. They should have access to the index used by the Premier League. So the verdict today wasn't the throwing out of the associated party transaction rules or a complete dismissal of Manchester City's case. Somewhere in between the two. The Premier League statement says that City brought a wholesale challenge to the APT rules that were unsuccessful in the majority of the challenge, It added that the tribunal deemed the APT rules to be necessary and that if prices above fair market value were paid, then competition would be distorted and the club would be benefiting from a subsidy, which is true. You can't get away from that. The league also said that the tribunal had rejected Manchester City's argument that the object of the APT rules was to discriminate against clubs with ownership from the Gulf region. In its statement said that, except in the two respects where City won, the tribunal found the City's arguments were unfounded, including on any alleged inconsistency in the approach as between certain types of clubs. It is a bit weird, isn't it, when billionaires are claiming that they're being unfairly treated. It just, something about it is a kind of bizarro universe for me. Something about seeing the Saudi investment fund or the Abu Dhabi-backed City Group as harshly treated, particularly when the City Group's flagship team has just won 4 Premier Leagues in a row. I don't know. But City fans are, as I said earlier, celebrating as if they have triumphed over evil. Now, what's next is that the Premier League will look into the 2 aspects that need changing, and it will conduct a process that will allow the league and the clubs to enact those specific changes effectively and quickly. Manchester City, on the other hand, have said that the Premier League was found to have abused its dominant position. It said that the club had succeeded with its claim that the APT rules were found to be unlawful, which to some degree they have. City added that the tribunal found both the original APT rules and the amended rules violate UK competition law, which they do, and the requirements of procedural fairness. The Premier League champion said the rules were found to be discriminatory because they deliberately excluded shareholder loans. Now, this is another thing I haven't really touched on. Within the context of the associated party transactions, the Premier League had never really addressed the issue of zero interest loans, which have been the building blocks of many of the successful Premier League teams. They allow for a certain amount of just lending the club money and getting it back eventually one day. Brighton have done this. This is not uncommon. But, and that's probably an oversight. That's something that should probably have been taken into consideration. But typically speaking, the amounts of money that club owners have loaned their clubs has not been anything like the amount of money that could flow into football. I do think that we are, as I said, at the crossroads of how football goes forward. Because whilst Manchester City fans are celebrating and Newcastle fans seem to be celebrating with them, because they can because they see this as a victory that will allow them to do commercial deals that may be a bit above fair market value. Certainly easier to do a deal with a club that's owned by the same person as the football club. Makes sense. But this isn't going to allow for an unlimited investment into football. If it did, if there weren't regulations on associated party transactions, then you can quite easily see why profit and sustainability rules would go out the window. Because the idea that you can only lose a certain amount of money when actually a private investment fund can just go, well, what about if we paid you 12 billion for naming rights of your stadium? Then you couldn't lose money and you could literally spend whatever you want. But this takes me to a bigger point, actually. Something we do have to discuss, because in the midst of all this is one major question, which is the Premier League and all football associations like the Premier League, are they just wasting their time trying to staunch the tide, trying to stem a tide of money that is going to flood into football whatever happens? And then I'd like us to think about what Friday's case, the Lassana Diarra case, might mean to that. Because when we're laughing at Todd Boehly and Eghbali's investment in Chelsea, it does seem ridiculous. Clearly, neither of these two are particularly fond of football. When you're a City fan celebrating that now you can have as much money flooded into you from Abu Dhabi as possible, and the Saudi investment fund can just open up its coffers and make Newcastle the powerhouse of world football, it doesn't seem to me like anyone's asking the question, why would they be doing this? Okay, so if you're a City fan, I'm quite convinced you probably believe that Sheikh Mansour fell in love with City as a boy and has always wanted to see the best football, and he doesn't mind what he pays for it. He's an eccentric, richy rich billionaire. He's just going to chuck money at it and doesn't care if he never gets that money back. The Saudi investment, the Public Investment Fund, similarly, they've just always been Geordies at heart and they want to see the Magpies finally winning silverware. Todd Boehly and Eghbali, financial experts. Look, the reality is quite obvious. In 2026, so just a year and a half away, the World Cup is going to be hosted by United States. And here are some predictions I would make about that. It will usher in a level of investment into football that has never been seen before. All bets will be off. One of the big players at the moment, if you enjoy watching Premier League football and you pay for your subscription services to Sky and TNT Sports, you know you're getting fleeced. But the kind of money that TNT Sports and Sky can put into football is nothing compared to what Amazon or Facebook or Google or one of the big entities could put into it. And why are they all interested in putting money into football? Because football has a captive audience that it's hardly possible to imagine in other areas. You watch week on week, you will definitely watch every episode you can. It's always different and it gives tons of content. It creates tons of content around it. So owning the rights to this is basically what the world is after. Everybody's trying to, including me, by the way, so don't forget to hit like and subscribe and don't stop watching. We're trying to capture your eyes on the screen as long as possible. That's what the modern world is. The major focus of everybody's interest is to keep you watching so they can sell you stuff. Now, I'm not actually selling anything. Perhaps one day, perhaps merchandise. If you like a cap, let me know. But we all know this, right? We know that the main aim of football is to keep you watching so that all of the advertising money that comes in around that is pumped up. But this amount of money will go through the roof if football becomes the most popular sport in the United States. The biggest market for sports entertainment is the United States. The largest growth area in sports is football in the under-18s. It's now gone past the National Hockey League. It's gaining some real traction, and people like Clear Lake are gambling that the value will double. That's not a bad deal, is it? Whenever you can double your money, do it. For entities like the City Group and for the Public Investment Fund, there are other things going on here. Saudi Arabia is committed to divesting its huge GDP from just being oil-based to 10% tourism. So having things like, I mean, the Qataris have been doing this with football, and now the Saudis want to get into it as well. So they have broader aims. Aims which are worth quite a lot of money to them, worth investing a lot of money into. The bigger question of all of this is, what happens if we just tore up the rule books and said, okay, everybody can spend what they like? Suddenly clubs would all be scrambling to get, bigger and bigger owners. Some would go bust, and the idea is that suddenly everyone would need a really rich backer, and that is true to some degree to compete. But the thing that always gets overlooked, and I find strange, is that if you allowed Manchester City to pay whatever they wanted for any player at any time, the Premier League could still insist that you're only allowed to register 25 players. So you can't buy all the players in the world. You could buy lots of players and have them not rostered. Maybe you could buy all the players and have them not rostered and not playing. But I'm not sure how workable that is. But here's the thing. If they're going to be allowed to spend whatever they want on players, who benefits? Well, at the moment, in the current transfer system, smaller clubs. Clubs would go out there, like Brighton do. They'd go and find a player like Estupiñán, or better still, Moses Caicedo, and pay a pittance for him and pay him $5,000 a week until Chelsea come knocking, and then they make huge amounts of money, and that money gets invested in the infrastructure and builds the long-term future of Brighton Football Club. So the money stays within the football ecosystem, because all of this money flooding in to football in 2026 will basically go out in transfers and will go to players who will get increasingly richer. And I'm not opposed to that. After all, they're doing all the work. That's who we go and watch. Maybe it's good for football, maybe it's bad for football, but there is a broader question. What is morally right, though? Should there be any rules? Are there any rules in capitalism? If you want to open a restaurant on the corner of a street with lots of restaurants in it, and you spend 10 times more than everyone on the decor, you get the best chefs in, don't you have a right to be successful? And if it goes bust, isn't it your money and you lost it? But what's really fascinating is the Lassana Diarra case, because beyond all of this, with all of this money flooding into football, there is another question. What if transfers aren't legal? What if you can't just buy and sell players like they're commodities? What if that's a type of slavery and actually doesn't hold up to European employment law or any employment law? Because most of the world operates in a system where not everything can be a commodity. There are some things you can't sell legally, and human beings is one of them. Now, I know that we circumnavigated this by not buying and selling players, but their transfer certificates. But the Lassana Diarra case has, I think, started the questions around that, which could, and I'm not saying it will, but it could lead to transfers being scrapped altogether. Now, what does that mean? That means that there are trillions of dollars coming into football because it's brilliant content, captures viewers' imagination for longer and allows for tons of advertising. Meanwhile, the main place where money goes out disappears. Transfers don't need them anymore. So yes, player wages can increase exponentially, but even that can't take up all of the money that could flood into football. So where will the money go? Where does that money go? And does that begin to explain why Saudi Arabia and Man City and Clear Lake are investing huge amounts of money? Why Stan Kroenke won't consider selling Arsenal to Daniel Ek for any amount of money? Are there people who know markets better than us seeing huge opportunities here that haven't existed before and falling all over themselves to invest and to own a slice of this? And then beyond that, a question for another day, because I think we've covered enough questions, and I do really want to hear from you in the comments what you think about all of this. But a question for another day is what happens when the bubble bursts? What happens to our beloved football when all of the money leaves? Because nothing is as certain as the fact that what goes up must come down. So I'm really interested to hear what you think. Overall, to summarise today, Manchester City did win the verdict against the Premier League in some part to say that associated party transactions as they stand are not fully legal and needs to be looked at and changed. A rift seems to have opened up between Manchester United, Liverpool and Arsenal against Man City, Chelsea and Everton, with some clubs undecided in between. A civil war in football between the oil-rich countries and the Americans. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's what I'm seeing on the Man City fan pages. And that essentially this somehow is a portent of things to come in 115 charges. It isn't, by the way. It's got nothing to do with it whatsoever. But those charges are all around profit and sustainability. And even if Manchester City were to lose those 115 charges, if the laws regarding what can be invested from within the City Group change, then they could lose that case and make up for it by buying themselves even more trinkets. I have always said this, by the way, and I just want to finish on this. I don't personally think it's as easy as going out and buying silverware. Paris Saint-Germain tried to do it and it didn't work. Some of the Galacticos in history have made everybody think that you can just go out and buy super teams. I remember the years when Real Madrid had done it and it just wasn't working. Let me know your thoughts. Where's the money going to go? What's going to happen? Are the Premier League and the football associations eventually going to lose to oil-rich backers like the PIF and City Group? Kind of feels like it might go that way. But I want to hear from you in the comments. Let me know. And until I see you again, be lucky. Lots of love.